There's been mixed reaction to the deployment of the SANDF to work with the SAPS to fight illegal mining across the country. President Cyril Ramaphosa says the deployment of the 3,300 members of the SANDF will cost nearly R500 million. Let's talk about this now and get a sense of whether or not they trained for this particular operation. Is this a good move? Let's speak to Stellenbosch University Department of Strategic Studies, Professor Abel, Esterhuyse, who joins us live now. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Is it a good idea?
Well, it's probably a good idea. You are sitting with a security problem and you will have to use your security forces to deal with the security problem. The question, of course, that we are faced with here is perhaps two issues. The one is the extent to which the military is committed, almost overcommitted in operations in the DRC, in Mozambique, border protection, and all kinds of operations. And secondly, the question as to how the government is increasingly using the military as a so-called stopgap institution. And within the context of those two realities, one has to consider the fact that, as Professor SANDF has pointed out in the aftermath of the 2021 KwaZulu-Natal uprisings, that the military is a hollowed-out institution. So we are really seeing the military being stretched here.
And you talk about that, and one thinks about the fact that about 800 soldiers, for example, they've had their deployment to safeguard the national key points as well as critical infrastructure in the energy sector, have their term extended to March 2024. Now this and the many other operations that you've raised, but is it a sustainable solution to the problems that the country is facing?
Well, domestic problems, one expects the police to take care of. I think that's the first problem one has to make, the first point one has to make. And then secondly, I mean, we've spoken so much and on so many occasions about the defense budget and the budgetary neglect of the military over time. And here we are faced with a critical reality where the military is needed. There's, of course, another issue here, and that has to do with the institutional and organizational makeup of the South African military. Militaries are complex institutions, and they are complex because they are normally required to do war fighting. And so militaries are organized for war fighting, and crime and the kind of operations that we are seeing the military getting involved in now is predominantly personnel intensive work. In other words, it is infantry type work. And one wonders to what extent the South African military is institutionally prepared for what they are expected to do.
And I was going to ask about, the question around the training, because as you say, that this is something that might just be in the spotlight. But let's talk about that, because one of the things you think about the fact that we've heard just how specialized and how highly organized these particular syndicates that are operating in the illegal mining space are. So is this a question of simply bringing in the military or also beefing up on crime intelligence, for example, and also some of the efforts by the SAPS as they're going to be working with it?
I think there's two answers to the question here. The one is the assumption in the 1990s, and there was a deliberate assumption that was used in talking about the military in future in the 1990s. And the assumption was that the South African military will in future not be deployed inside the country. And the military, in a way, prepared itself based on that assumption. So from a training perspective, from an organizing perspective, from an equipment perspective, a doctrinal perspective, the military in essence have done away with the in-depth capability that it had in the early 1990s, for example, for domestic deployment, and the way it was prepared in the early 1990s for domestic deployment. I think a critical factor. But there's another factor here, and I think this is perhaps the most critical, is the extent to which the private security has increasingly become an important player in the domestic security arena. And to some extent, we have seen, and specifically in the illegal mining environment, we've seen the private security industry stepping forward in the last year or two as a critical role player in dealing with the illegal mining problem. And I wonder whether one shouldn't look at bringing the police, private security, and the military together in the development of a truly strategic capability to deal with this problem.
And is it enough time as well? I mean, the operation right now said to be going on until April 2024. Is it enough time to crack these syndicates?
Well, I don't have that tactical knowledge to know precisely, the detail of what is unfolding on the ground. I know this is an extensive problem. It's a problem that is now coming that's been long in the making. And I think the military will need some time here to deal with the problem. Whether we'll see an extension of the time frame to deal with the problem, probably.